Okay, as you can see, each chapter has been given a title. Chapter 1 is about different aspects of religion. We're going to talk about in the sermon today about pure religion. Then chapter 2 is about respect, respecting God and respecting our fellow man. And then chapter 3 is about responsibility. And then chapter 4, he sort of begins to put the cap on the lesson, okay? He's wanting to sort of finish the book, so he begins to sort of make, I guess, I wouldn't say personal application because the whole book is that way. But he begins his conclusion, if you will, all right? So we begin in chapter 4, and we'll talk about resisting some things, all right? And I have broken this down into, I believe, four different sections. Resisting strife, verse 1. Resist your surroundings, verses 2 through 6. Resist the devil, verses 7 and 8. And then resist the schedule. Okay, and I'll sort of share with you what we mean by that in just a moment. All right, let's begin. James chapter 4, verse 1. Will somebody read James chapter 4 and verse 1?
Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members?
Okay, where do fightings come from among you? So he begins to sort of, close out this idea. Now, he's doing this because of what was mentioned in the previous chapter, and I'll notice that in just a moment. So, chapter 4, resisting some things. Number 1, resist strife. What would you say is a number 1 cause of fights? Whether in the workplace, in your marriage, in the church. What do you think? Selfishness. Man, you hit it right on the head. Very first thing. That's good. You know, somebody said, a lady, she said, me and my husband divorced for religious reasons. He thought he was God, and I thought he wasn't. You know, selfishness can destroy all kinds of relationships. It's interesting to me, you look there close in verse 1, he said, where do wars and fightings come from among you? They come even from your pleasures or your lust. What he's saying is selfishness. Anytime I have ever argued with my wife, one of us is being selfish. Anytime I've had a disagreement with somebody that I know, one of us is being selfish. The same is true with everyone else, right? I mean, it's certainly a principle that can apply across the board. Now, I want to give you some scriptures here before we go on. I've got 5 or 6 of these, and let's talk about how we can avoid strife just for a moment. Let's go to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. There was one couple that was arguing, and the man said, will you just meet me in the middle here? She said, yes, I'll meet you in the middle when you admit that I'm right. You know, it's hard to resolve conflicts when a person will never admit that they're wrong. And when a person will never say that they are sorry. So let's be the better person. You know, I sort of feel like sometimes if we just step back from a moment from the argument and say, all right, what's really the issue here? Am I just trying to get my way and win the argument? Or am I trying to listen to the real issue? And I'll be honest with you, when I have done that, I'm not always good at that, of course, but when I have done that, I want to tell you, it makes things much better for everybody that's involved in the conflict. So how can we squash conflicts? Let's go to Philippians 2, verses 2 through 4. Will somebody read that for us?
Make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others.
Okay. There's a lot of keys in there. I like your translation that you used there because it said, do nothing through selfishness and what was it?
Or empty conceit.
selfishness or empty conceit. You know, the King James says strife or vainglory. I like your translation. It actually used the word selfishness.
Josh, I've got a note in my Bible.
Yeah.
July 26, 16, Al Franks preached that to us when we were having so many troubles.
Okay. Wow. That's pretty interesting. To me, Al Franks knew how to handle about every situation that would arise. And I remember when we were trying to get things ready to have elders installed in the congregation, I knew he was a man to call. And I called him. I said, look, we need you to come help us to get everything set up. And he came. And to me, it went so much smoother because he was here. So yeah, that's a good lesson. You know, anytime we want to squash strife, he says this: let each esteem the other better than themselves. It's not about getting my way. It's not about winning the argument. And I guess probably I'm the world's worst at that. But anytime I have applied this, it's worked. It really works. So anyway, I hope that we can sort of apply that in our homes and lives. Now, I want to share this with you. I found this when I was studying. I thought this was interesting. It was kind of weird to me, but I noticed that strife is one of the lust of the flesh. And I just looked up the word strife, and I came across this, and I was like, well, man, this is among some of the worst sins that we could think of, you know? And you'll notice that the lust of the flesh come because of selfish desires. It's pure selfishness. Think about it. Adultery. If a man cheats on his wife, we say, man, that's just pretty low, you know? But we also don't know everything that's going on in their home either. But, you know, for the most part, we think that's pretty bad. Selfishness. Fornication, adultery, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulation, wrath, notice, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings. I want to know which one of those can be separate from selfishness. They're all kin to it in some way or some form. And strife was mentioned among murder. I thought that was weird. And adultery. Some pretty serious things. All right, if you're there in the book of James, let's go back to chapter 3 just for a second before we move on. There was a man who made salsa. He was sort of a guy who loved to prepare things, and he had perfected this salsa recipe, but it was really hot. I mean, and people who like spicy stuff, they loved it, but people who didn't, they couldn't eat it. But anyway, he was a member of the congregation, and a lot of times he would hand out these jars of salsa to people. And one guy said he's passing out little jars of hell. And anyway, I guess it was a sample, you know, of what it was going to be like. But it really burned people's mouths really, really bad. You know, I would hate to be labeled the guy that was passing out samples of hell. And really, when a man creates strife in people's lives, that's what he's doing. Because I want to tell you, that's exactly what hell is going to be like. It's going to be a constant state of feeling like you are in a battle and you will never, ever win. Go back to James chapter 3 and verse 16, and the reason why he continued this into chapter 4 is because of what was mentioned previously, chapter 3. He said, for where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. The devil is the master at strife. Okay, so now I want to give you one more. Now, we talked about how to squash these strifes or these things that arise, right? He said, look, man, everything, not on his own things, but on things of others. Let me give you one more, and then I'm going to move on from this verse. Let's go to Romans chapter 14, and let's look at an example where people actually argued about something. Okay? And this is actually a religious argument. You say, well, this guy believes this guy believes this, and they're quarreling amongst each other. How do they solve it? You think that happens in the church? It does. It does. And it's very common. So here's what I found to help. In Romans chapter 14, you're going to read these 2 chapters with this in mind. You've got a brother who thinks it's okay to eat meat that is sacrificed to idols. And then you have another one who thinks that it's a sin. And they disagree. This guy thinks he's going to hell because he eats the meat that's sacrificed to an idol. And this guy, he thinks he's crazy because he thinks he's going to hell. How do we solve the issue? All right, chapter 14 and verse 1, and then I'll ask somebody to read chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. He says this, "Him that is weak in the faith receive you," but notice, "not to doubtful disputations." Okay? If the weak brother thinks that it's wrong to eat the meat, then don't argue with the guy. You know, in fact, it's probably not a good idea to let him know that you're eating the meat anyway. Just leave him alone. You know, there's no reason for the guy who's been, let's say this guy who eats the meat, he's been a member of the church for 30 years. He said, the meat is meat. Who cares whether it's sacrificed to an idol? I don't care. An idol doesn't mean a thing to me. Neither does the meat. I just want a good steak for dinner. But this guy, he's a new Christian. You know, he's maybe only been a Christian for about a year. And he thinks, he walked up to that idolatrous temple where everybody could see him, and he bought that meat and brought it back home. He said, I can't believe it. So what the writer, Paul, is telling this older, seasoned Christian, the guy who's not weak in the faith, he said, don't argue with him. Okay, let him grow. Give him time to understand that the meat is nothing, the idol is nothing. Okay, he even mentioned that a little bit later. Paul did. He said, the meat is nothing, but not to him. All right, will somebody read chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, and he gives the solution. How do we solve this?
We then that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak, not to please ourselves. But every one of us please his neighbor for his good, to edification.
Okay. It's okay to eat the meat, but not with him knowing. It's not okay. In fact, if you go back to the end of chapter 14, you look at what he says there about the older seasoned Christian and what he can do. Okay? Look at verse 22. Hast thou faith, that is, do you think you can eat the meat? Okay? With faith, can you eat the meat? Hast thou faith? Have it to thyself before God. Okay? He don't need to know. He said, happy is he that condemneth not himself in the thing that he allows. But he that doubts is damned if he eat, because he eats not of faith, and whatever is not of faith is sin. So the weak brother, he can't eat the meat because it transgresses his conscience. And if he transgresses his conscience, he's committing sin. Okay? So leave him alone. You know, we don't want to invite him over for dinner and put a big ribeye in front of him and say, yeah, I went up to the temple and bought that for you today. You see, then he has to back away from the table because he will transgress his conscience.
Take that ribeye back with him.
Yeah, well,
I would eat it.
yeah. Well, this is more than just a steak. You know, this is deeper to him than just a piece of meat. So there's a lot going on here. This is actual an argument between two religious people about two religious positions. It's not a matter of faith. It really doesn't matter, you know. It's just a matter of opinion. And he says, in matters of opinion, we need to make sure that we please our neighbors. You see, it's not about winning an argument. I mean, because really, if you just want to get down to the brass tacks, this guy is right. The seasoned Christian is right. He can eat the meat. He could go up to that temple and buy the meat if he wanted to. It doesn't make any difference. So if we say, who's right in this matter? Well, really, this guy's right. Because it doesn't mean anything. But because of his conscience, you see, he said we need to make sure that he doesn't fall away. That's the important thing. So resolving the argument means it's for his good. All right. Probably spent a little too much time on that, but that's sort of the idea here in James chapter 4. How do we resist strife? He said, do not be selfish. You know, I can think about times that I've even had disagreements with church members, and I step back from the issue. I can think of one in particular, and I thought to myself, you know what, this can get ugly if I'm not careful. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to swallow my big head and think to myself, what's most important in this issue? Was I right? You better believe I thought I was right. And I thought I was done wrong. And I let them know that I was done wrong. But in the ultimate scheme of things, I could have hurt someone else's faith in the process. So I said, you know what? We're going to have a meeting. And we're going to meet with the elders. And we're going to fix this. So that's what we did. And so far, it's been great. But I want to tell you, if I was not careful, that situation could have turned ugly. But I think the biblical pattern is sometimes the best way to go, despite whether I was right or not. Really, that's not the issue. All right, so number 2, he goes a little deeper. Resisting things is James chapter 4, number 1. He said resist strife. Now he said also resist your surroundings. Look here in verse 2. You lust and have not, you kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you have not because you ask not. You ask and receive not because you ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lusts. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God, and whosoever therefore is a friend of the world is the enemy of God? Do you think that the Scripture saith in vain that the Spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy? He gives more grace, and wherefore he said, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Now there's a lot there, there's a lot going on, but I think in short we could sum it up with, we have to resist our surroundings. You know, I was talking to my father-in-law just the other day. He's been preaching for a very long time. In fact, he's been preaching in Fairhope for almost 20 years. He's been at the same congregation there. He serves as an elder also while he is preaching. He has been through more in his preaching than any other preacher I've ever met. He has been viciously attacked. What I used to think was over and over and over again. Now, the last 10 years or so, it hasn't been that way, but he's one of the wisest men I know as far as dealing with worldly situations in the church. Something he said to me sort of stood out. He said, when you are born in this world, the fight is on. That stood out to me. You're exactly right. The devil at that moment, you see, you have entered his territory at that moment. You know, I think about 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4 when he said, if the gospel be hid, it is hid to them who are lost, in whom the God of this world has blinded the minds of them. He's talking about the devil. And Paul called the devil the God, the little g, the God of this world. This is his territory. Well, he is causing us to be sort of enamored with the surroundings. Now, there are several things that I want to mention here that sort of stand out. You'll notice first, verse 2, he said, you lust. He said, you desire to have. Verse 3, he said, you ask amiss, that you consume it upon your lust. In verse 4, he called them adulterers and adulteresses. said they were having a friendship with the world. The next key is the word enemy. And then in verse 5, he said, the spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy. So I think what my father-in-law said is very accurate. The war is on. And it's not always going to be an easy one. All right. When I think about the word world, I think about instant pleasure instead of lasting meaningfulness. You know, the here and now is what the world is all about. All right. Let's go back to James 1:27. Now, I don't want to give too much of this away because some of my sermon is going to deal with this morning. So I'll notice a few things and then we'll move on. There was one boy. He said, I prayed for a bike, but that didn't work. So I stole one and then I asked for forgiveness. Well, I think his mind was all mixed up, you know. He was thinking like the world thinks. Instead of being patient and waiting for God, you know, that's what being spiritual is all about. It's about waiting for God. Instead of being patient, waiting for a lasting result that's actually meaningful, he said, you know what, I'll just get what I want right now and then I'll pay for it later. That is exactly how the world thinks. All right, now notice James 1:27 here. Whenever you're ready. Unstained, literally. Unstained from the world. Now, worldliness can be described in a lot of different things, you know. But I sum it up in this way to say instant pleasure, because some people think that worldliness is something when it's really not. But to describe it accurately, it literally is an instant gratification that leads to a sinful result. And he says, a man needs to keep himself unstained from that. The best example I could find is in Hebrews chapter 11. When the Bible says that Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin, notice, for a season. The instant gratification. He said, no, I'm looking for a lasting result. To be with God, to focus on spiritual things. And that to me is really the sum of what James is talking about. All right. I'll notice more of that in my lesson today. Let's talk about praying for a minute. He said, you ask and receive not because why? Okay, yeah. You ask amiss, he said. I want to give several principles about prayer just for a moment. And I want us to think about something, okay? Somebody said this. If the request is wrong, God says no. If the timing is wrong, God says slow. If I am wrong, God says grow. But if all are right, the request, the timing, and myself, then God says go. You know, there have been times in my life when I prayed very, very hard for something that I thought was very, very important, and I felt like my prayer was not answered. At least not in the way that I thought it should be. And I'll be honest with you, I was very angry. I'll give you an example. When my mother-in-law was battling cancer, for about a year there, my children were really, really concerned. I remember my son, he was about 6 years old, 5 years old, and he even made these little bracelets to sell to help my mother-in-law pay for her medical bills and her cancer treatments. My little kids, they would cry. And I would hear them praying to God at night when I would go in their bedroom and pray with them, and they would pray for their Lily that she would get better. And every single scan that she had, she got worse and worse and worse. Me and my wife, we begged God, we prayed. And we didn't understand. And I'll be honest with you, I'll sort of share something personal with you. I was so angry that I got to where when people would be sick and most people would comment and say, "We'll be praying for you," I wouldn't say that. Because I thought, it's not going to do any good. Why am I going to tell you that I'm going to pray for you when it ain't going to do any good? Now, that's very personal. Hopefully I will be able to recognize that's not the way I should feel. But I would say things to them like, "I will be thinking of you." I wouldn't say I'm going to keep you in my prayers because I was angry. I was so upset. And I thought, God tells us in the Bible to pray. Pray for people that are sick. The more I thought about it, I thought, I don't understand the situation, but God does. My job is I have to learn to trust God more. But I'll be honest with you, when I hear people say, they overcome their cancers and they say, "God was with me the whole way," it affects me differently. And I begin to think in my mind, I think, well, he wasn't with my mother-in-law. She was one of the most godly women I ever met. What about the little 2-year-old boy that gets hit from behind by a drunk driver and everybody's safe in the car except for him? He died. Why the little 2-year-old child? Why did he have to die? Where was God when that happened? Well, I'll be honest with you, I really don't know. But the way that I answer now is, if God were to heal my mother-in-law of metastatic breast cancer, then He has to heal everyone who has metastatic breast cancer. It's not fair, The truth of the matter is, when cancer spreads and it metastasizes, it will kill people. That's a law of nature. So anyone who gets metastatic cancer, whether it be colon cancer, lung cancer, or breast, when it metastasizes, it will kill people. That is a law of nature. So if God steps in for my mother-in-law and says, "No, I'm going to break this law of nature for you," then guess what He has to do for everyone else that gets metastatic cancer? So maybe that's the reason why. I don't know. But there are some things about prayer that I have tried to focus on that I think will help. I want to give you 3 of them. Let's go to 1 John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5. Now, I wrote these on my paper when I was studying for this. I did not put these on the screen, but I'll mention them quickly and then I'll move on. 3 things that I believe help me to understand how God answers prayer. Because James said, he said, "You ask and you do not receive because you ask amiss." How do I avoid asking amiss? Number 1, when I pray, I have to realize that I need to keep God in heaven. Okay? Let's look at 1 John chapter 5, verse 14 and 15. Will somebody read that for us?
Now this is the confidence that we have in Him, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know that He hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we have asked of Him.
Okay. We know that we have the petitions, but only when? When we ask according to what? According to His will. You see, when I was praying for my mother-in-law, you know what I wanted God to do? I wanted Him to come down from heaven and heal my mother-in-law right then. And I was misunderstanding a principle. When I pray, I've got to let God do His job, but He has to do it from heaven. He's not going to miraculously come down to earth and heal my mother-in-law, because then He's got to do that for other people too. So that helped me a little bit. Number 1, I need to keep God in heaven. Number 2, I need to keep myself in His hand. Let's go back 2 chapters. Look at 1 John chapter 3 and verse 22. 1 John chapter 3, verse 22, and I'll mention this and then we'll move on. But John is writing, and once again, he talks about God answering prayer. And he said, whatsoever we ask, we receive of Him because we keep His commandments and do those things that are pleasing in His sight. So if I want God to answer my prayer, then I need to make sure that I'm living with God, that I'm living for God, that I'm on God's side. You know, I can't say to God, Lord, please help me to land this new job I've been wanting for 10 years now. When all that time in 10 years I've been working every Sunday, not been going to church. You know, it just doesn't work that way. I want God to answer my prayer, then I need to keep God in heaven. Number 2, I need to keep myself in His hand. Number 3, I need to keep others in my heart. We'll go back to the book of James on this one. James chapter 5, verse 16, it says, confess your faults one to another, and notice, pray for one another, that you may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Now you'll notice, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much, but what was he doing? Was he praying for a selfish desire? He was praying for someone else to be forgiven of their sins. When is the last time that you prayed for your wife, for your husband, that they would be forgiven of their sins? It's pretty deep, isn't it? God says, if I want Him to answer prayer, then I need to keep God in heaven. I need to keep myself in His hand. I need to keep others in my heart. And another thing I would add to that, I just need to trust Him with the result. That's my job as a Christian. Do I have every right to be angry that I felt like God didn't answer my prayer? Well, sure. You know, my children ask me sometimes, can we go get ice cream at Sonic today? And I say, well, no. Now, yesterday we did, but we can't do that every time. You know, and my littlest one, Madden, she's been learning at school different emotions, right? They taught them about anger and sadness and joy and all this. So she comes home the other day and she says, I am angry. And I was like, where did that come from? She's never said that before. So anyway, come to find out, Mariah texted her teacher and found out they've been studying about different emotions at school, and ever since then, she's been a basket case. But at any rate, you know, she could get angry all she wants to because I told her, no, we're not getting ice cream. But I'm the dad. A lot of times I know what's best. You know, my children, since Halloween, they've been like sneaking candy everywhere. You know, I come around the corner and one of them's like, I said, what do you got? Like the 5th time that day I've caught them with candy, you know. I'm like, look, you have 2 a day. That's what you need. I'm tired of paying for fillings, you know. But I mean, you think about it. Not just 3 weeks ago, we had to take them over to Chris Griffin and 2 of them got fillings in their mouth. I understand they like candy. I like candy. But a lot of times we need to know what's best. God always knows what's best. All right, any question or comment before we move on? All right, I was hoping to get a little bit further than this. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 7:14, and then I'm going to move on from this idea. 2 Chronicles 7:14. As a whole, as a group, what can we do for God to hear us? Okay, let's apply this in a group setting, say the Ripley Church of Christ. We've got specific prayers for our congregation, right? Maybe we've got something going on, we want it to be successful or whatever. What can we do to help with that when we pray to God? All right, this is a good passage for that. 2 Chronicles 7 and verse 14. Will somebody read that?
If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and will heal their land.
Okay. It's God's people. God said, I will hear you. Okay, I will hear you. So, sometimes we think God is not hearing. He's hearing. It just may not always be the answer that we expect. Okay. Let's move on. Let's go back to James chapter 4. Let's talk about humility for a minute. You know, he mentioned that in this passage. They shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face. Look there in verse 6, James 4. He gives more grace. Wherefore God said he resists the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. Notice what humility does. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. When I looked at this word submit, it literally means to put under. Okay, it's a combination of two words, and the first word is a preposition. So literally, the Greek man, when he is reading this, he literally reads this under to put. Okay, when he sees that combination of those two words, that's literally what he sees. And the English says submit. All right, thank you. We'll pick up on this next Sunday. Wednesday night, bring your books. We'll get back on the study of the glorious church. Thank you.